gonna try to record again, much harder today because it is raining. Hopefully I can be heard. I'm gonna be trying to be louder, and I'm just gonna go straight through because this is not a instead of reacting to bit by bit as I did with Pajot video so far. This is just Paul Vanderklay's rewilding videos the past 2 days. So yeah, Paul, this has been very useful and interesting ways. So there's your direct feedback that you asked for. I want to say a couple things though. Sorry that I left in my comment.
In a quarter mile, keep right at the fork to continue on I-495 South.
I won't necessarily repeat the comment I left on YouTube, but basically, well, as you're pointing out, the language we use has a lot of tells. And
keep right at the fork to continue on I-495 South.
It's very interesting because, you know, you have people like Jordan Peterson who, you know, will basically tell, the way he frames this thing will be kind of like this Judeo-Christian tradition. But when I listen to your videos, especially, also Tom Holland, whatever, I don't listen to him as much as you do, but like, it just becomes so obvious and clear to me how not Jewish this
in a quarter mile, use the left lane to take exit 45B toward Virginia 267 East.
Yeah. While the Jews lived in the West and these things were happening around them, we were so
use the left lane to take exit 45B.
And it didn't catch up to us in many ways until to Jewish emancipation in the
continue on Virginia 267 East for 3 miles.
Slightly earlier in the beginning of the 19th century as opposed to the middle of the 19th century. Either way though, right, so like for instance, there was kind of I would say, an early school of something, like we had scholasticism that penetrated to some extent, and we even had some extent of penetration of things like nominalism, but they didn't carry over in the same way because we had such a different worldview that they couldn't translate to this in the same way. And I've been working on this idea lately. I was trying to think, where are there's obviously some major differences between Christianity and Judaism, historically and
in a quarter mile, take the Virginia 7 East, Leesburg Pike exit toward Falls Church.
But they're not all theological. And even the ones that are theological aren't the ones that would get often debated in this corner. So, like, you know, we don't have to...
take the Virginia 7 East
Trinity
exit, then keep left at the fork to continue on exit 47B.
Are only two small bits about everything to talk about here. And there's quite a lot more.
Keep left at the fork to continue on exit 47B.
Yeah, excuse my GPS. So, I wonder if this is really going to work today. So for instance, thinking about, well, no, let's get into it a little bit. I know this is my
keep
comment.
right at the fork to stay on exit 47B.
On your video from yesterday had been, it's so telling that when you say biblical scholars, you really mean academic biblical scholars.
In a quarter mile,
like
merge onto I-495 South.
What I meant by that is university trained. And this is a point that Jacob's trying to make to Father DeYoung, right? That when Father DeYoung says Talmud scholar, it does not mean the same things when Jacob says Talmud scholar. Because we recognize that there's kind of two very different worlds of scholarship. There's like the academic, who
continue on I-495 South for 9 miles.
If they're nominally or fully like Orthodox, and practicing believing Jews, are coming at the text from an academic framework, and sometimes we use scholar to mean someone who, you know, would have been interchangeable with the word sage, or we always almost mean a rabbi, though that's not always as true the past, like, say, 20 years, well, you generally mean someone who has essentially traditional yeshiva training, Jewish training, and experience with the text as an insider, taking the framing of kind of the traditional approach to these texts, and seeing them kind of within a very different set of just about everything. I mean, like, they may not know anything about, like, let's say the Persian Sasanian Jewish context or, like, the Persian language, but, you know, they're going to use the traditional exegetical commentaries to understand what the text means. They understand how the text is embedded in a larger framework of discussions spanning, 1,000 years or plus. And it just means something very different. And the type of and level, it's not just a question of level of scholarship. Because often, yes, those Talmud scholars actually know a lot more Talmud than the academic ones, but that's not always the case. And then when I say more Talmud, I mean, like, they can, they know by heart, or it's part of their being, that they can, like, cite sections here and there. So, I mean, it's the same thing's going to go for biblical scholars, right? When we use biblical scholar, I mean, you mean academic, and you mean the university is such a part of your world, it's so baked into your worldview, and it's just part of it. And, like, you don't, and I get the sense that maybe, right, this is not a hard and fast rule, right? There are biblical scholars with no university training who are much, much more traditional, and do take these approaches. These non-academic approaches to the text, where this is a lived text, and they come at it. And maybe for you, I mean, so you say that's one of the pastors, but I don't know that necessarily, because rabbis spend decades grappling with these texts before they become rabbis, deeply, like, and in the text itself. Maybe this is true for, I think this is certainly true for other religious traditions. I have a sense Eastern Orthodoxy is like this, where maybe not with the text itself, but certainly with things like the church fathers, like, kind of you're embedded in the tradition, and you have sages, or people who are particular, like, I don't want to even use the word expert, because even that comes with, like, all these modern connotations. But you have people who just are extremely knowledgeable about the text and come at it from a very traditional perspective. That's one part. The other section here is kind of approaches. So you said, with the Reformation, you have this whole thing that's about back to the text and back to and trying to, like, drive things from there, and using it as a corrective. And you also have this, people caring about the grammar, right? The grammatical and the historical. Those are things that Jews, and actually Muslims with the Quran, were already doing for centuries before the Protestants, right? And some of it seeped in a little bit during, let's say, the golden age of Spain with the School of Barcelona. But it seeped, that really more for Christianity was about the Greek texts, whereas for Jews and Muslims, like, it also helps develop, I mean, it predates this too, these very different approaches. I mean, there's already a historical approach, like, attested in the 13th century in the Jewish exegete, too, in fact, 12th and 13th century, right? We already have kind of a rationalist approach in the 13th century emerging, but we have the grammatical approach in the 8th century, and the 9th century, because the Muslims and Jews were already, like, really invested. And I think this is partially under the influence of Islam, as the Quranic language becomes much more formalized and, like, taken seriously. But you have very early grammarians of the biblical texts who, like, are doing, but the Midrash is already doing this in the 1st century, the 2nd century, the 3rd century. But you see a much more formalized, I'd say, Greek style under grammars being written by Muslims and Jews by the time you get to the 8th, 9th century. So if these impulses existed earlier, you see they become formalized later. And yeah, I mean, polemic against superstition and all those things are, and in some ways, a lot of what strikes me is both how much, both in the Renaissance and in kind of the Protestant turn, how much Judaism both already had stuff, but also like influenced things. So a lot of the humanists in the Renaissance were in Italy were being influenced somewhat directly by Jews who had been essentially exiled to Italy when they were forced out of Spain in the Inquisition. Jews had been leaving Spain for a century before the Inquisition, before the 1492 like final expulsion orders. But with the final expulsion orders, that was what got a lot of the educated, say, sages, rabbis, to leave, and their kids, and that generation, mostly their kids more than them, started integrating into the Italian city-states, and doing things like teaching Hebrew to people like Pico de Mirandola. But there was a whole kind of renaissance of interest, Christian interest in Hebrew and Kabbalah, right? That starts filtering in funky ways, and then of course with the Protestants you see very explicit, especially in the English. Among the English, you see this massive interest in understanding the Bible and learning Hebrew and like the Jewish context, and it's just fascinating to me because I think what you end up getting is this funky mix. Obviously, these people are still working in a primarily Christian context, but you get these Jewish ideas that start like really reshaping Christianity in ways. And yes, you can say, okay, well that makes it even more Judeo-Christian. Like instead of saying Judeo-Christian, it's just like, oh well, obviously, like acknowledging that Jesus was Jewish and that these ideas initially were Jewish, which is a very, very modern thing. That's not what this original wave, I guess, of let's say Hebraism was interested in as much as understanding the Old Testament better. And there are reasons why the KJV uses kind of the rabbinic Bible for its Old Testament. It's all tied to this, because where are these things being done? You have Bibles being printed by Daniel Bamberg, a Christian in Italy, who's being exposed to kind of Jewish intellectual stuff from a Christian perspective, and then you also have the KJV is being put together in England, where there were no Jews until Cromwell takes over. But even then, no, they had been there. They've been kicked out. Cromwell lets them back, and there have been a couple that were still there before Cromwell, but they're kind of hiding there.
In 2 miles, use the right 2 lanes to take exit 57B for I-395 north toward Washington.
But you definitely see this this renewed interest, kind of, and it's just interesting to me, right? So when you tell the story of the West, and like, okay, yes, this is the major narrative, I think, of the West in many ways, what you're pointing out, and I'm not going to dispute that. It's just interesting to me how outside of it, in some ways, the Jews were, and how we, in some ways, have not only created counter-narrative, but how we interact with the main narrative. And I'm not going to, like, this isn't like Jewish conspiracy theory 101 here, right? Judaism influenced Christianity in this period because of a renewed interest in both, I would say, cosmopolitanism and universalism in the humanist era, and then secularism in the Enlightenment, which allowed for a lot more interfaith talk and cross talk. Like, this very conversation could not happen if all that stuff hadn't happened before. Right? You wouldn't be listening to me because I wouldn't have any Christians in my audience as a Jew without that stuff happening. Probably. I mean, I don't know how this year pans out. And yeah, no, it's certainly interesting to hear just how bad like the Catholic Church was. I mean, I had a sense of some of this, um, and this just kind of reinforces some of my impressions. But something I do want to ask about. Maybe
in a quarter mile, use the right 2 lanes to take exit 57B for I-395 north toward Washington. In a quarter mile, keep right to continue on exit 169B. Follow signs for Springfield, Virginia 644 west.
To kind of have two different...
Keep right to continue on exit 169B.
2 or 3 different parts to it. And I'm trying to kind of tease those out. Because there's one sense of rewilding as kind of like what the Romantics were doing in reaction to the Enlightenment, let's say the German Romantics in the 19th century, where you have this like return to nature, paganism type thing, and like appreciating, let's say, the pagan aspect of Christianity, which might be anything from the pre-Socratics, and like the role of Oracle, to like shamanic, this ties into obviously the psychedelic conversation, but there's also these like funky pieces.
In a quarter mile, keep right at the fork to stay on exit 169B. Follow signs for Virginia 644 west, Old King Mill Road.
But just like more kind of embodied, lived, the monks in their gardens, or nuns or whoever.
Keep right at the fork to stay on exit 169B.
The return to mystery, which both has kind of a romantic capital R notion.
Keep right.
As well as kind of these things with like the Eastern Orthodox and the Catholic and the kind of the mystery of divinity and the sacred, and awe.
In 1,000 feet, turn right onto Commerce Street.
Oh my gosh. And then there's this like return to ritual, which I think is a little bit different. I don't know if that's really necessarily wilding the same way. Maybe that's not what you mean. And then there's like the kind of...
Take the next right onto Commerce Street.
Let's say, I would say really wild, right? When you get to like New Age, spiritual, psychedelic.
In half a mile, turn right onto Franconia Road West.
Really wild elements of Christianity. Or like that filter in this kind of from the spiritual world, like the spiritualist world. Crowley. There's an openness to like this much more out there, I'd say, wildness. Yeah, which to me this is all like fascinating because it's just so foreign. In some ways, right? I see some of the New Age spiritualists coming into parts of some kind of Jewish stuff a little bit, but like we're not undergoing a rewilding in the same way. I think in some Hasidism was our rewilding. It's already like 300, 250 years old or whatever it is, 300 years old. Let's see, 16. I can't do math this morning. But it's old, right?
Take the next right onto Franconia Road West.
340 years old. Okay, so yeah, so we've and it's also in part I think we're outside of it too, coming mostly from...
Use the middle lane to keep right at the fork.
What I say?
Keep left at the fork.
Coming from Eastern Europe more, right? So like because I'm from...
Continue for half a mile.
Like the rewilding happened kind of in the same context as like the old believers in Russia and the Eastern Orthodox and the Pietists in Eastern Germany, and like these things were happening right too from 200 years ago, 150 years ago. Like
in a quarter mile, keep right at the fork. Follow signs for I-395 North, Washington.
We didn't have like a taming. I guess we're losing the wild. We didn't have the taming happening at the same time or place.
Keep right at the fork.
Ways. And we're not reacting to it as strongly. And a lot of that's, I think, that's this whole thing that like Christianity. I mean, everyone does.
Keep left at the fork.
But through these conversations, like it's kind of been made clear to me that like a lot of what's happening here is there was like too strong of a reaction to something, and then like it gets counter-reacted to until like things kind of hopefully find a new balance, right? I've had this discussion about the concept of suffering in Christianity lately, where you have like a much higher stress than, say, Judaism, on like the importance of suffering in making a person.
Continue on I-395 north for 6 miles.
And then you have like a counter-suffering narrative that arises. It's kind of the prosperity gospel, which is also too strong in the other direction. And it wouldn't have arisen if there wasn't such a strong, you know, like pro-suffering stance in the first place, probably from Christianity. And I mean, I'm just using this as an example because every religion does this, and it has like these backs and forths, I think. But so we're seeing that here too with the Reformation, the Counter-Reformation, the Protestants, you know, maybe needing to stop protesting or protesting as much, right? That these things were important as correctives, but then there's like also something. There's maybe I'm an engineer, right? Control theory, like you want to come back to like a calibrated position that isn't too extreme in either direction, or we can just say this is Aristotle's golden mean. I'm just all over the place here, but yes. So this telling. So yeah, it's been enlightening. It's been interesting. Other things in this conversation I wanted to, I guess, address on this, I'm gonna say on topic, or try to at least, is so one of my hobbies, Paul knows this, but I don't know if anyone else here does really, is genealogy and genetic genealogy. And I know he brought up at the very end of that conversation yesterday, the role, like, is genealogy and genetics kind of the same thing? Well, I actually would separate them a little bit. Genetics is just the kind of the general interest in study of genes. Genetic genealogy is using genetics for genealogy, and then there's genealogy, which is generally kind of the paper-based, historical kind of evidence-based methods. They require different skill sets, and they're very interesting, and I won't get into it, but if you ever want to have a conversation about this, we can. There's a huge debate in genetic genealogy, though, that I want to touch on here because it's super related. So, one of the big debates that happens is how we define race versus ethnicity versus kind of like people group or similarity, affinity groups in genetic genealogy. Now, what that means is I can look at your genes, and I can look at another person's genes, and I can get a measure of the similarity between those two sets. There's different measures of similarity. We can talk about that. And there's, kind of general similarity of the full set versus kind of just look at the X or Y chromosome and, or mitochondrial DNA, and then, to trace, let's say, your paternal line or your maternal line purely. Those are interesting things. Now, if I test a bunch of people in a group, machine learning can detect a pattern between those groups. It maybe detect multiple patterns. And it can do that without me telling it to look for patterns either, right? It can just find like clusters of similarity. And yes, depending on what metric you use for similarity, you might get slightly different results. But for the most part, these tend to be somewhat stable. Like what we do, like what's actually done, like by academics for rigor, is they'll use multiple methods to kind of build a case through redundancy, right? That we really have like a valid set of clusters or a pattern here that's real, and not just like a artifact of the way we're measuring. Okay, so let's say I use 3 different methods, and I can find patterns. And sometimes those patterns are, let's say, more continuous. Sometimes, so I might have a spectrum of people, like on a line, or some sort of multi-dimensional space, but it's continuous. Whereas I could have very distinct clusters. I can say, oh, these people fall into this category, these people fall into this category. And I may not have a word for those categories. I can just see there's a cluster here and a cluster here. I think this is what some people who don't know AI and machine learning kind of miss, is that there is this whole field where the machines themselves come up with the patterns, and we don't label them. This is often something that comes up in unsupervised learning and sort of comes up in reinforcement learning, for those who like want details. And they're a little different. And I'm not going to get into it, but essentially, sometimes the machine can just kind of it can detect patterns on its own without us telling what's salient. And often those patterns necessarily won't be salient, or they'll be salient to the machine to complete, let's say, for some things you give the machine a task, and then it tries to find patterns that help it complete that task. Often, when you do that without like giving it some rules, it will find things that you'll never have thought of, that it's going to exploit and kind of cheat in order to figure out the task. So these things could be like, you tell it, I want you to guess, try to, guess what cards I'm holding in my hand.
In 2 miles, take exit 7A for Virginia 120 toward Glebe Road.
Say a reflection behind you, and like make much better guesses, but you'll have no idea. And there's very little ways with this specific algorithm, for instance. This is a type of reinforcement learning algorithm that uses deep neural nets. You would never be able to figure out how it's making those guesses because it's a black box. It can't explain it easily. And that leads to problems, of course. And this is something that we're trying to work on, and for those of us in this field, because we want the AI to explain how it got to that conclusion so we can check if it's cheating or not, for instance. Or it might exploit anything, right? You can find patterns in anything that humans just wouldn't be aware of, and it will find them salient even if we don't, or we might find them salient but consider them like cheating, right? So going back to the race ethnicity affinity group discussion, I can find similarities. I could have a group of people and I could test them. And that group of people might claim to be from one race or ethnic group, or whatever, and I might then say, oh, well, I now have a genetic test that can detect if someone is Jewish. I don't know. Now, of course, there's a lot of problems with that. One,
in half a mile, take exit 7A for Virginia 120 toward Glebe Road.
You're not going to have any person who's like is a perfect, almost never, because it's statistical. You're never going to have a person who's like 100% perfect, like Jewish in a statistical sense, probably. And we're seeing this with the DNA companies, where like people who are born Jews
take exit 7A, then use any lane to turn right onto Virginia 120 South.
Generally get told, that they're 99% Jewish or 97% Jewish. Because these algorithms are statistical and there's noise in them. And two, Judaism's not an ethnicity because we allow conversion.
Use any lane to turn right onto Virginia 120 South, South Glebe Road.
Three, you don't know if someone's Jewish because if they converted to Judaism, there's no way to detect that in their DNA. Or if their parent converted to Judaism, okay, and then they married a Jew, so like who has a good established genetic lineage, then that they might have only show up as 50% Jewish, but we're really 100%. So that's one problem.
Continue on South Glebe Road for 1.5 miles.
As Paul's pointing out, we have kind of these academic. We understand that our words are constructs and that they're products of our time. So right now is this concept that was not true, let's say, 100 years ago, but we do take as kind of this matter of fact today that race is a construct. And then we need a different word for a genetic affinity group, because race is generally based on phenotype. It's how someone presents to the world. So if they have, at least in America, right, and this is also cultural, which makes it super complicated. So race generally means how you present to the world physically. So if you have dark skin, you might be classified as black, which is now being much, much more nuanced, right? Because that would have been a very clear conversation 50 years ago. If you had dark skin versus, or if you appeared white versus black, it could be categorized into two categories. Now, of course, we understand that there's lots of ethnicities that don't have, let's say, white skin, and there's lots of ethnicities ethnicities within white as well. And this is where like race is a construct, because it's really how we define it, whether it's counting Italians as Jews as white versus not white at different points of history, or Irish, versus if we count Aboriginal Australians or South Indians as black. These are big conversations, and they're very, very tied to culture. Because in Australia, when you're talking about Aboriginal peoples, it was not that uncommon to use the term black for long periods of time, and it was acceptable, or at times, sometimes it wasn't. But there was also like a lot of cultural affinity, where like the Black Power movement, for instance, or civil rights movement before that, things were brought over and then used. I mean, this from everywhere. I mean, both in sub-Saharan Africa and in Australia, and because of there was just an affinity seen between these groups, because of a shared, not necessarily because of a shared racial perception, but because like they're fighting, they saw a shared racial struggle. There was a clear connection there, even if there was no historical basis for it. Like it's and I wouldn't say it's a metaphorical basis in the same way. It's an analog, right? More than anything, it's an analogic basis. It's not the same as ethnicity. The problem is, of course, is ethnicity doesn't using that term doesn't necessarily free you from this debate, because ethnicity.
In a quarter mile, turn right onto Potomac Avenue.
It's more acceptable to understand them as having a genetic basis. The boundaries of what of who's within or without an ethnicity are very, very complicated. In part, this goes back to like I'd say the early concepts of modern race in Spain, with things like the one drop rule, and how that's played out, let's say in America with Native Americans, and differently in Latin America and South America, where you have kind of this mestizo, like in between identity, to mixed race identity, but there's still like lines around who's indigenous and non-indigenous, and who can claim to be a member of a tribe and who can't, and for some groups, right, it would be like you have one grandparent or one great grandparent. For other groups, it's like a clear paternal line or a clear maternal line, and we just don't have. Right, this is a complicated conversation, because each group kind of defines its identity, and specifically identity as it's passed.
Turn right onto Potomac Avenue.
In different ways. This is having a huge effect right now in a legal case in the United States dealing with the slaves of Native American groups who are who've been fighting. You probably don't know. It's not gotten a lot of coverage, but it has made it to like the high courts and things in the U.S. The slaves of the Creek and Cherokee nations, who are suing the tribes essentially to have tribal rights, because they want them to. These were African American slaves.
Continue on Potomac Avenue for 3/4 of a mile.
Where who were owned, used by Native Americans, and then when they were freed, and the Emancipation Proclamation, how that worked for the tribes and things is a little complicated, but when they were freed, essentially, they felt that they were kind of owed tribal membership, because the tribe should be taking care of them and they should get things like health insurance and all the things that the U.S. has done for the Native American tribes, which isn't really that. We can talk about whether it's enough or not. It's kind of limited, but they
in a quarter mile, turn right onto East Glebe Road.
They do have some special rights and things they've been given, and there's concepts of the tribal profits from the tribally owned lands, and things generated on those lands like the casinos, and there's also things like the tribal like the Native American health care system that the U.S. government runs, and it's a hugely complicated system, but it exists.
Take the next right onto
Whether it's
East
good or
Glebe
not,
Road, then your
they feel like
destination
they
will
should
be on the
getting
right.
healthcare coverage through it. This came up especially during COVID, where this has been a fight for decades and decades.
Your destination is on the right.
So anyway, yeah. So ethnicity isn't so simple. Race isn't so simple. We could try to ignore both and just talk about genetic affinity, and generally that's often for a lot of groups just like kind of geographic. So instead of looking at these other categories, we can just look at geography, and where people lived kind of determines who they had kids with, and yeah, I mean lots of people had kids with lots of other people, in lots of ways. I mean, certainly it wasn't always through marriage, and sometimes it was rather violently and in ways that people, non-consensual ways. And all that kind of matters, right? Like, but to some, I mean, right? It creates people's identities and histories, and it's just, and then people like create and use that to build their own self story, their own historical personal narratives, and we're seeing this a lot now as people genetic test and like get ethnicities they didn't expect, and they like want to learn about them. Or whether they expect them or not, they want to learn more about them, and they go to places like Senegal or Ghana or Israel or Eastern Europe or the Netherlands, because they know they had ancestors there, and they think the way we mythologize not just history but also geography is just a huge part of this. There's big questions about the ethics involved here, and how and how people should treat these things, and whatever. Anyway, that's my little rant for this morning. It's not quite done. It's been interesting, and well, I guess you can let me know what you think. I know this is different,